everyone, we're going to start talking about sources and bias. 1 second. There we go. Finding sources. Once you've found your topic, it's time to start finding and vetting sources that you will be using in your papers. And for this paper, you're going to be using a combination of both primary and secondary sources. And just as a refresher, primary sources can include things like government documents, autobiographies, personal correspondence. Those are things such as letters, diaries, social media posts, survey, etc. You can also use surveys, work of art. Let me go back just a second. For those surveys, you can kind of make your own survey if you want to. And if that's something that you're very interested in doing with the classes, I'm very happy to help you coordinate that and put that together. Primary sources are also works of art. A lot of people don't realize that our works of art are considered primary sources. Photographs, newspaper articles written by those close to the source, and that's key, close to the source, either reporters that have experienced it firsthand or the majority of the news article is a person who has experienced it. In interviews, like we did a few weeks ago. Secondary sources, which you'll probably wind up using a lot of secondary sources. These can include academic articles, academic books, such as biographies, history books, etc. Reviews, essays, news articles, and videos that report on an event and aren't constructed by those actually close to the event in your textbooks. So where do you find these sources? And you can find them in a variety of ways. You can conduct your own interview. You can create a survey. As I said, I would be happy to help you with that if you want to. You can look at an academic database, the MTSU's library or Rutherford County Schools library. You can use a search engine like Google Scholar. Use library books or magazines articles. Use the internet carefully. And that is the key, carefully. So what does that look like? You have to be very careful with online sources. Anyone out there in the world can buy a .com or a .org, create a website, and upload it with a ton of false information. Usually, websites that end in .edu or .gov are reliable, usually. Wiki sites can be edited by anyone. There's been some debate lately as to whether or not you could use Wikipedia as an academic source, and that can have good information. But I would say no. I am not going to allow any type of Wikipedia on this particular paper. Now, this doesn't mean that articles or videos and websites are not good sources. You just have to do a little bit of research to determine if they're okay to use. So these are some things you want to consider, like who wrote it? Is the author considered credible, or are they an expert in the field? Where is it published? Is it published on a website that's known for bias, which is prejudice for or against a thing, group, people, ideas? Has it been peer reviewed? That means, has it been reviewed by a group of experts in the field? Are there other articles that specifically show that the information presented is wrong? Like if you say Google the title of the article, and then all of a sudden it comes up this huge thing saying, oh, this article that was published about diabetes is completely wrong, and this is why. Then you might think, oh, maybe that's not so reliable. Did it use sources? Did it have interviews, expert testimony, firsthand experience? Did it have other sources that it brought in? And if they did use those sources, did they cite them? And that is key, because it might say, according to Dr. Smith, but then it doesn't maybe offer a link back to the original source material or have one of those bibliographies works cited at the end of the article. If all of that is missing, then how do you know that that's what that person said? And how do you know that that is true? So if it's lacking citations, that is a huge red flag that this particular article lacks that logos, lacks that logical appeal. And credibility. It has no ethos. So you have to look for all those things as you're looking for reliable sources. Once you get all of your sources, and this is jumping the gun a little bit, but I think it's really important that you know this, synthesizing your sources. Now, before you even get started, know the direction of your paper. You don't want to waste time looking at sources that you're not going to use. So, for example, let's say you're going to be doing a paper on vaccine safety, and you want to ignore all of the autism stuff because that's been done a lot, which I don't mind. If you want to do that, that's great. But let's say in your mind, you're just like, I don't want to go that way. I want to look at maybe some other things. you don't want to waste your time looking at a bunch of articles about vaccines and autism, because that's not going to be helpful for you. So just already kind of know, and that's why I'm having you do your proposal, know the direction you want your paper to go in. Now, know that that can change. If you get into your paper and start doing your research and start finding all these articles, you might find something in one of your sources that you're like, wow, I didn't even consider this. So let me go off in this direction, because I think that that's a really awesome way to present this information. That's fine. Or something to include. That's perfectly fine. You can definitely include that. But that's part of that synthesis process. You're going to take a look at them, because when you're writing your paper, you just don't want these random quotes in there and just have them there for no apparent reason. You want to take a look at them and see what areas that your sources are agreeing in or disagreeing in, to see what insights that they offer to help you create a more comprehensive paper. So just as an example, so again, back to the vaccine example, let's say that you're doing this paper and you find a source from a Dr. Jones that says there's no evidence of vaccine injury from the MMR vaccine. But then as you're researching, you find two more sources, one from a Dr. Smith and one from a Dr. Anderson, that show, hey, there are some allergic reactions. They're rare, but they do occasionally happen. So one thing you might want to do is go back and do some more research on that first source. Maybe see, okay, is this doctor credible? Is who he says he is? Where is he getting this information exactly? Just to make sure that it is a good, valid source. If it checks out, you could say something like, though some experts like Dr. Jones say there's no adverse reactions to the MMR vaccine, two separate reports, one by a Dr. Smith and a Dr. Anderson, prove that though rare, there are sometimes reactions, but that should not stop parents from vaccinating their children. So in this example, this shows that they are safe, but caution should be taken. So your sources don't always have to agree, and that's part of that synthesizing process. Sometimes there'll be counter arguments, or sometimes there'll be a slightly different idea, and it's perfectly fine in a research paper to show that there is not consensus. And a lot of people mistakenly think, oh, everything has to agree. And no, that's not the choice. That's not necessarily the goal of your paper. You can say the majority of people believe this, or the majority of people agree with this, but as long as you have to have the sources to back it up. And it's perfectly fine to note that there are differences in research, and sometimes the evidence isn't always clear, but you do want to highlight the ways your sources agree and connect to each other. So that way, when you're constructing these paragraphs, you can actually bring in more than one source to prove your point and show that what you're stating is in fact correct based off of the research that you've brought in. So bias, this came from, it's actually a political thing on bias, but I thought it would be applicable here. We're not going to go over all the different types of bias in depth, but bias is basically prejudice, what people believe and what they don't believe, and that can come from a variety of things. So one of the things I really like to point out are the authority biases. So we're more likely to trust and be influenced by ideas that come from authority figures. But sometimes people don't actually go back and make sure that what this authority figure is saying is true. And that can be very dangerous. And that's how a lot of false information is spread. The Dunning-Kruger effect, you can write a whole research paper on this. It's basically people who think they know a lot about something, but really they don't. And they just go spout it off as facts all the time. The framing effect is how we draw different conclusions based on how an idea is presented to us. So sometimes you can get a rhetorician who is very, very skilled in presenting information, and they can present information in a way that seems correct and believable, and really it's not. That's why you have to go back and double check your sources to make sure that what they're saying is true. The groupthink, a lot of people fall victim to this, is where people don't want to have conflict, so they just don't say anything, or they just conform to it. The availability cascade, that happens a lot too. An idea accumulates more credibility as it spreads. That happened with vaccines and autism. One doctor published a report saying that vaccines caused autism. It got a strong hold in especially and no offense against mommy bloggers, I am all for them. Create your own income, be entrepreneurial, all that you want. But they latched onto that, and that false information spread like wildfire on the internet. And so it kept a lot of children from being vaccinated. Now, it's your choice if you want to get vaccinated or not, but a lot of people base their decisions off of a false report. And that's what happened. That cascade of false information came down. And then we got a false consensus, overestimating the proportion of people who agree with an idea. And you see this a lot. The majority of Americans think this. Oh gosh, let me think of something. What would be a good example of that? The majority of Americans think that building the wall was a great idea in Mexico. Was it? You heard that a lot on the news and through reports and through different politicians. But if you notice in a lot of those reports, they didn't really have the facts to back it up. So you have to be really, really careful with stuff like that when people make kind of these large claims saying the majority of people think this. Well, really? Where's the evidence? Where is the survey? Where is the, report that shows that what you're saying is true? Where are the interviews from people giving that information? That's why it's so important to really sit and evaluate your sources. The declinism doesn't really apply. It's more of this idea that society is doomed. And I think every generation has thought that. That's its own special kind of bias there. So you're not going to really run into it that much. So when we start looking at these sources, one thing that we have to be aware of are our own biases and the potential bias of the creator of the content. Everybody has biases. And what it is our life experiences shape how we view the world. And not everyone agrees with the way we think. There's a lot of things that go into how we come to believe what we believe. Research papers are based in facts and use sources as proof. And that's why it's so important that we evaluate these sources for bias to make sure we aren't presenting false information and thus damaging that ethos of our papers. And, I'll admit I have my own biases that come from how I was raised, where I was raised, what I believe. But that's just the thing when you're doing papers like this, and it took some practice, years of practice, because sometimes our first gut inclination is to go, I don't agree with that. And sometimes to maybe shut down and not be open-minded to try to see someone else's point of view. But that's one of the keys of research writing, is actually taking the time to kind of consider someone else's point of view. Because this has happened more than once where a student starts writing a research paper, they got their thesis all settled, and they start doing their research, and then they realize that maybe, just maybe, they were wrong in their thinking. Or not necessarily that they were wrong, but maybe the other side wasn't exactly wrong either, that the issue is a little bit more gray than they realized. It wasn't quite so black and white. And so just be open-minded as you start these research papers, and just know that as you're doing your research, it might change your worldview on that particular topic. And that's okay. It is perfectly fine. That's one of the exciting things about research writing. So just go into it with an open mind, being willing to expand your horizons, and being willing to really, really try to make sure that the sources that you were using are correct in their information. So we'll be going over this more in our Zoom meetings and both in our reflection and our writing to learn this week.